From classic whodunits to modern psychological thrillers, each episode offers exclusive insights, behind-the-scenes stories, and discussions on the art of crafting compelling crime narratives. Whether you're a seasoned investigator or a newcomer to the genre, Books to Die For is your ultimate guide to the thrilling world of crime literature.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren. I got Mr. Joe. Mr. Joe is here.
I'm in the house today, Al. I'm in the house.
Yeah.
Outside's got too much allergies and too many cicadas. We got to talk cicadas, right?
Yeah, Mr. Joe Cicada, the new cicada author.
I wrote down the title for my idea folder, The Cicada Killer, the guy who kills every 17 years, right? Something like that.
Yeah.
You never stop thinking.
Yeah, see, you learn every time you do a show. And today will be no different. So we've got quite the, I was going to say writer and just everything. So let's just bring him in and talk to him about his new project, Mafia Spies, which will be a 6-part Paramount series coming on July 16th. And it's tying in with the book. The book is released on June 4th here, Mafia Spies. It's an update of the 2019 book. Thomas Maier, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Alan and Joe.
Listen, this is you've got quite the career, and I mean that in a great way. You've got so much really good stuff. Like people really seem to like what you do. That you did The Masters of Sex, of course, Mafia Spies. What inspires you to actually stop and go, I want to write about this?
In college, I went to Fordham University in the Bronx. And I had a Jesuit teacher who was a great journalism teacher, but he taught a class about biography writing. And we had to read a lot of biographies. And one of the books we had to read also was a book called America in Our Time. It was actually written by a British historian. But in essence, that's been my book writing career for the last 30 years. It's about America in our times. So I wrote a biography of the Kennedys and about their how their Irish Catholic immigrant experience impacted their public and private lives. I also did another book about the Kennedys. In between, I did Masters of Sex about the sex researchers, Masters and Johnson. But then in 2014, I did a book about the Churchills and the Kennedys and more about the build-up to World War II and kind of the relationship between the two families. I also did a book about Dr. Spock, the baby doctor, whose life is almost like Forrest Gump. It really encompasses the entire American century. In fact, I'm thinking about this summer, 100 years ago, Ben Spock won the gold medal at the 1924 Olympics in Paris, and now we have the Paris Olympics again 100 years later. So I'm thinking of Dr. Spock. Mafia Spies kind of grows out of naturally, almost it's the third in my, if you will, Kennedy books. Not a particularly positive thing about the Kennedys. It's about one of the most difficult things during JFK's tenure, which was how to deal with Cuba. And I look at the CIA, and the CIA historically was an agency that was at first gathering intelligence. By the time that we're looking at the late 50s, 1960s, they were also getting involved in what is known as covert operations. In other words, instead of being passively observing what's going on in other countries, in this case, they actually tried to get involved directly in a country by attempting to kill Cuban leader Fidel Castro, who had just taken over Cuba, had thrown out all of the gangsters that were running casinos in Havana, but throwing out a lot of the American business interests, proclaiming himself a communist. And that really sent shudders down official Washington. And so President Eisenhower, in the last stages of his tenure, they approved a plot to go ahead and try to kill Castro. And this was something that was inherited by the the incoming Kennedy administration. So in 1960, this plot really starts going. And essentially it was decided by the CIA to hire two gangsters a guy named Johnny Roselli and the head of the Chicago mob, Sam Giancana, to be part of a plot to kill Fidel Castro. So that's, in essence, if you had to boil it down to one line, it's how the CIA hired two gangsters to try to kill Fidel Castro during the Cold War. And then what happens to these two characters, Roselli and Giancana, at the very end.
So there's a lot there, and I'm former agency, plus I teach social media conspiracy theories, so it's kind of all these things in my head, and I was in covert action when I was in the agency. But my question from the point of view of writing is, how do you take all these sort of known and researched, controversial, whatever, how you want to say it, topics, and put that into a book that has a thematic string through it? Because there's a lot of stuff there. How did you do it?
That was the biggest challenge of writing this book. And I do think the book does pull it together. And I'll tell you the key to it, at least in my opinion. It's that instead of doing like a term paper, like a lot of books, they read like term papers. What I tried to do, because a lot of my books have been biographies, I realized that telling the story of these two gangsters, that was a good window of looking at all these different worlds. So they were the principals that the CIA was hiring to try to kill Castro. That's Sam Giancana, the head of the mob in Chicago, and Johnny Roselli, who was a Chicago mobster who early in his career was sent out to Hollywood. And Johnny became the fixer for a number of studio heads. He was known as Handsome Johnny. He dated a lot of incredibly attractive women actresses like Lana Turner, Donna Reed of It's a Wonderful Life. Dated Johnny. And he also met a woman named Judy Campbell, who's almost like Monica Lewinsky in this story. She gets involved first with Roselli, then with Frank Sinatra, who is very much involved with Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli. But then Sinatra introduces Judy to JFK, then a senator planning to run for president. They meet in early 1960 during the early parts of the campaign. Focusing on these two characters, it's kind of like a window that you can actually follow things. And I think things become more clear and less tangled if you look at it through the experiences of these two very different men, these two gangsters. And, I do get into the biographical aspects. And there's a degree of compare and contrast, kind of like when you were in college or in high school, they would say, okay, compare and contrast. When you look at these two men, they're very different men. I had a lot of fun with that as well.
So how did the book structure, as you did, translate to the miniseries coming up? Sort of like what is left in, what's left out? So for the reader, for the person who reads the book and then sees the thing, what are they going to go, oh, no, Tom, what did you do?
There's a lot of stuff in the book. With the TV show, the way I described following the two gangsters, I think they really condensed it so it's even more so focused on the two gangsters. Because with a book, sometimes you can go off a little bit on the sidebar here, but fundamentally, I was very keen on in the book, in sticking with the two gangsters and telling the story through that window. And the TV show does that even more so. The story of how book became a TV show is a pretty long one, but in a nutshell, I had a previous book called Masters of Sex, which was a biography of the sex researchers William Masters and Virginia Johnson, and it became a Showtime television show from 2013 through 16. And in 2015, I was invited to lunch by the head of Warner Brothers Television. My wife and I, we went to their dining room, and the head of Warner Brothers asked me, so what else do you have in mind? What are you thinking about? And I said, well, I'd like to do my next book on two gangsters who are hired by the CIA to kill Fidel Castro, and ultimately they get murdered themselves at the height of all the investigations about this, and nobody seems to know why. And the head of Warner Brothers said, great, let's try to do it. So I said, well, there's only one problem. I haven't started writing the book yet. Like I said, this is what I'm thinking of doing. So I started writing the book, and pulling things together. But we shopped it initially as a drama series. And so that was in 2017. And because I hadn't finished the book, we couldn't sell it. And so in 2019, I finally published the book, Mafia Spies. And then COVID came along, and it just became too difficult to sell as a drama. And so we sold it to Paramount. Ultimately, Paramount has it as a 6-part, 6-hour documentary series where there are both myself and a number of well-known historians and journalists who have covered this, but also there's recreations of key scenes that were done at the Paramount lot. So I'm really I think the TV show's terrific. I think the TV show is going to be right up there. It's very much in Paramount, which made The Godfather. Is very much particularly like Godfather 2, if you like that type of stuff. And it's got a lot of the humor of Sopranos. In fact, the guy who plays Johnny Roselli, the lead gangster really in this story, Nick Nunziata is the name of the actor. And he actually was in The Sopranos. He was in 6 episodes. So we have a certain gangland lineage, if you will, to Mafia Spies. And so it's a long story of how it became. It was about a 5 or 6 years journey, if not more. But it's finally here, and I'm thrilled about it.
Well, that's just fascinating. So as a former agency guy and as a fiction writer, and you have a fiction book coming out as a nonfiction author, and I just wrote an article myself on this. I'm asking the question, how is the CIA a character in your book? What role does it play underneath? Because it says Mafia Spies, okay, so it's in the title. So is it a ancillary part of the motivation behind these guys, or is it sort of a main character as an organization?
I think this is very much a spying book. You know, I do, because I'm interested. I used to work as a Chicago Sun-Times reporter. That's where I started my career. And actually, I covered the murder of a big-time mobster in Chicago. So I've always been interested in that. But fundamentally, this story, Mafia Spies, is about the CIA and its first really big attempt at covert operations in terms of trying to kill a foreign leader, at least as far as we know. It has been debated ever since. It began in 1960, the actual plot. We have debated back and forth. The people that authorized it, Alan Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, he had served in World War II. And so they thought a lot about, geez, if we had assassinated Adolf Hitler, just think of how many lives perhaps we could have saved. So when Fidel Castro took control of Cuba, only 90 miles away from Florida, and the idea that he would become a communist, that he would become part of the Russian empire, if you will, that the Soviet Union was growing, and the idea of putting nuclear missiles in Cuba created a huge crisis for the Kennedy administration. There was the Bay of Pigs invasion. There was the Cuban Missile Crisis that happened during that time. But underneath things that the American public did not know was the attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro using these two gangsters. And I think this book really pulls it together for the first time.
So the two spies here, Mafia Spies as you call them, how do you get into the writing of those characters? Who are those characters based on?
Well, it's interesting because Johnny Roselli was not his real name. He was an illegal Italian immigrant to this country. His family landed in Boston. He got involved in crime and actually fled to Chicago. And that's how he hooks up with what was then the Al Capone gang. This is in the 1930s. And so Johnny is sent, because he suffered from tuberculosis, they sent him to Los Angeles to be the Chicago mob's guy in Hollywood, fundamentally. And that's what Johnny was, kind of like the muscle for studio heads and such. He got involved also with the casinos in Havana. And that's where he works intimately with, closely with Sam Giancana, who he had known as a young man, but they particularly worked together in the 50s and early 60s. And so when Castro throws the mob out of Cuba, They're all upset. They want to get rid of Castro, and it just happens to coincide with the CIA's wishes. With Sam Giancana, he's almost like this flip side. If Johnny Roselli is this Casanova type of character, Sam Giancana was a guy who had a house out in the suburbs. He was married, had 3 teenage daughters, and then suddenly his wife, screaming at the kids, drops dead. And so he's like this bachelor father who they thought would be kind of quiet. And instead, he kind of goes out to Las Vegas with Johnny Roselli, who's already out there. And Sam winds up going from kind of this more quiet type of mobster to a guy who's now in the papers because he's become friends with Frank Sinatra. He's dating a singer, a very well-known singer named Phyllis McGuire. So he's now in the newspapers. And so that invites all the scrutiny by the FBI at the same time that they're working for the CIA. So it is an incredible set of circumstances. The fact that these two guys are kind of like outlaw friends together. They're like it's kind of like a buddy movie in a way, in the sense that we follow the two of them during the course of this whole scenario, which takes place over about 20 years until they both get murdered.
Wow. And the Rat Pack, like, how did they connect?
Well, if you look at the FBI file of Frank Sinatra and even some of the other members of the Rat Pack, but particularly Sinatra, you see the close relationship that he had with Sam Giancana in particular. The impact of Giancana, the influence on Sinatra is considerable. There are certain demands that Giancana makes of Sinatra. There's an involvement in the JFK campaign of 1960. You know, it's interesting that I also kind of play with something that I think is kind of obvious with Sinatra's, even his music. That in other words, when Sinatra first became famous during the World War II period in the 1940s, he had a very sweet voice. It was almost not a boy act, but kind of a sweet tone. And in his 50s, he develops more of that gangster persona that I think people really relate to him as an entertainer. They see him, even today, a lot of people see him as kind of like the first gangster type of entertainer. I mean, he was a tremendous artist. How this scenario and the experiences that Sinatra had, how it affected his art, I do deal with some of that. It's just, again, it's a sidebar. But so much so that Sam Giancana and Frank Sinatra actually dress the same. And interestingly enough, the relationship between Sam and Johnny kind of mirrored the relationship of Frank and Dean Martin. Johnny was kind of like Dean Martin, a very suave and very handsome guy. And Frank was a bit like, he very much wanted to emulate the style of Giancana.
So how do you write the dialogue? How do you get into the heads of these characters to write how they communicate with each other and what they think of other people?
Well, it's interesting because the FBI put listening devices into the headquarters of Sam Giancana in Chicago. So there were a number of books. There was one particular book that was written by an FBI agent by the name of Bill Romer, and he was like the number one guy running after the mob in Chicago. And there's quotes from those tapes. There's also testimony from before the Senate by various different characters involved in it. The opportunity for actual quotes and dialogues is probably more than I anticipated going into this book. And so that helps it gives you a sense of what these people are like and how they talk and to some degree how they think.
So what do you hope everyone gets out of this, the new book and the series? What is it you hope they take away?
Well, I do think it's a very highly entertaining book. I do think there's some broader questions about assassination. As I mentioned, I think we're still debating whether or not we should be involved in that. And with drones, for instance, we are involved. We're back in the assassination game. And whether or not it's justified, should it be a tool of foreign policy, you could certainly come away from Mafia Spies debating that in your mind. I also think the whole aspect of the mafia as a underworld force in our society, or certainly during the 20th century, I think is of great interest to people. Ultimately, though, I think it's an extraordinary story with a lot of different twists and turns. It's almost like when you go to an amusement park and one of those type of roller coasters that keeps on twisting and goes up and down and over. That was a big part of the storytelling here. And I think the TV show is really gripping. It's funny. There's a lot of different moments that are surprising. It captures that feel for the Rat Pack, but mainly it's the two flavors of spying and the mafia together. And that was also what was really compelling with me. In fact, I wasn't calling the book Mafia Spies originally. I was calling it another name. And yet I found myself referring to it as that Mafia Spy book when I would talk to friends about what I was doing. And it dawned on me, I said, wait a minute, has there ever been a title, Mafia Spies? And I looked it up and there hadn't been. And it was like hitting the bullseye. And that's exactly what it's all about.
Now, listen, you're busy too, right? Because you've got this other book coming out here in a month, in early July, I believe. What is it, the 9th?
Yes, on July 9th, I have a book called Montauk to Manhattan. It's my first novel, and to some extent it takes advantage of the insights that I learned about how books become TV shows. In this novel, there's a reporter, not me, but a little bit of me, has written a book, and it's a historical novel, and it's being made into a TV show out in Montauk, New York. It's at the far end of Long Island. The TV show is about the book that this fellow has written, and that book is about how the Indian lands were stolen by a railroad tycoon who owned the Long Island Railroad. And what he wanted to do, back in the day in the 1880s, when people came over from Europe, they would come over in ships, and by the time they got to Montauk and they went along the shore of Long Island, that was very treacherous. There were a lot of shipwrecks. And so this tycoon, his name was Austin Corbin, decided that if he could develop a rail line from Montauk where people would get off their ships and then jump on a railroad train, it would be about 3 hours by rail as opposed to a day and a half and running the risk of having shipwrecks. So he essentially stole the lands from the Montauk Indians. And so that's what's going on out in Montauk. And the fellow who's the protagonist in this story, his name is Jack Denton. He's a reporter for a New York newspaper. It's the summer of 2016 when they're making his book into a TV show. He's covering the Trump campaign. It's the rise of Trump. It's, that time I wanted to capture to some extent what it was like where people said, wait a minute, this guy, Trump, he really could win. And I think people nowadays now forget, but back in 2016, a lot of people wondered, geez, could he really win? So that kind of captures some of that flavor. So I wanted to put what I learned about TV making into this novel, and it's part of a kind of like a murder mystery. There's an actress that goes missing. And so fundamentally, that is what Montauk to Manhattan is all about.
You have a fiction book. You have a nonfiction book. You have a nonfiction television program coming out. You already have a lifetime of being a writer and a creative person. For those who might be listening, what's the different creative focus, juices, skills, requirements that go into such a broad spectrum of the entertainment industry where you're going to have readers and viewers paying attention across that spectrum?
Well, to some extent, it's preparation, and to some extent, it's luck. You make your luck in life, though. And so I follow a very traditional route of being a reporter. I just retired, quote unquote retired, from Newsday, the newspaper here on Long Island, after 40 years. So that's been my home. I went to Columbia Journalism School, and I learned a lot about television making. The last 10 years, I did a lot of TV reporting for Newsday as well as print writing. So the combination of print and TV, particularly in the last 10 years, is something that I've developed. That's something that I definitely push with younger people when they ask me the question that you've asked. I think having multimedia skills is really, really important. Learning how to edit video, for instance, is as important as learning the structure of how to write a chapter, or how to write an essay, or how to write a book. The form and learning the form is part of it. As far as ideas, I think the ability of writers are really determined by the greatness of their ideas. And if you can come up with great ideas or insights into things, I think that the market will recognize that. And I think in the case of Masters of Sex, that was the big breakthrough in my career, because I wrote a book about Masters and Johnson, the sex researchers. And believe it or not, nobody really wanted that book. It was a very hard sell, but the book got done. The book got published. It got reviewed by the New York Times, both on a Friday and then that following Sunday. And suddenly Hollywood was interested, and we were off to the races from there. In that 4 years that Masters of Sex was on as a TV show, I learned a lot. We would go out to Hollywood, my wife and I, and just observe. We were like right behind the showrunners and the directors, sitting right behind them. For a week, we would go out to Hollywood and just watch the making of it. In the novel, Montauk to Manhattan, I kind of capture that. I think it's by being multimedia, reading a lot, and doing a lot. Either writing a lot or even learning how to edit video, for instance, how to shoot video and how to do that. I think that's something for this younger generation that's absolutely invaluable.
Listen, so do you like to interact with viewers, readers, fans on social media? Do you have a website? Where do people find Thomas?
Yes, I have a Facebook page. The thing that I would recommend is if people want to learn more about me, I have a website. It's Thomas Maier Books. My last name is Maier, M-A-I-E-R. So it's thomasmaierbooks.com, and you can find everything about me on that webpage.
Well, fantastic. We're going to have that up on our website, too, so people can find you easily. And we appreciate you being there, and we look forward to seeing it. Mafia Spies, 6-part Paramount docuseries, and it's debuting on July 16th. It will also be on Showtime, and the book, the new version that relates, the tie-in to that, is out on June 4th. So we appreciate you being here. Oh, and don't forget the Montauk to Manhattan book, which comes out on July 9th. So, Thomas Maier, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
This has been a production of the House of Mystery Radio Show. To find out more about our show, guests, or hosts, go to our website at houseofmysteryradio.com.